There we go. If I don't start it now, I'll forget. We'll
Yeah.
be into it a little bit, and then we'll say, "Oh no, we should be recording."
The voice always kind of creeps me out.
Yes, yeah. Oof. It was coming a flood when I was coming in this morning. It's bad out there.
Oh,
Well,
yeah.
not at this exact moment, but
Yeah, I was woken up this morning from some thunderstorms. I'm in Louisville and it was pretty gnarly. Like it definitely sounds like a couple of things may have gotten struck. Those type of
Mhm.
lightning strikes. Like, oh, that sounds like a tree or something.
Mhm. The crisis line's rolling over right now to get transferred.
Hey, Lauren. Hey, Barrett. All right, I think we're just waiting on one more to join us.
Now, can you hear me? I say hello.
Yes.
Okay. All right. I was talking, but you couldn't hear me.
Oh, here's Christine.
Right.
Okay. Megan, is this everyone?
She on? Did she join us? Okay, yes, this is everybody.
Okay, amazing. You want me to jump right into it or?
And I was on mute. I said yes, go right ahead.
All right. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for making the time to meet with me today. My name's Mallory. I'm an advocate with Hope Harbor. If at any point in time you can't see my screen, or we have any technical difficulties, please unmute or just say something. I will not be able to tell. I'll get into a groove and just keep going, and I don't want to not notice. I do just want everybody to be aware we're recording today so that you can keep this presentation for the long term. Hopefully that'll be helpful for you. So if you need to revisit any of the topics that we discussed today, then you can just revisit the video. I am going to do something very quickly. Okay. And I also curated my sources for today. So a lot of this obviously is coming from my position and the knowledge base that we have here at Hope Harbor, but I tried to create a sources guide with some additional reading in case there's any one topic that you find very interesting or you want to review the full source. So I did send that to Megan this morning and she can send that out to you. So today we're going to be talking about the intersection of violence and power and considerations for working with sexual assault victims. So we're going to start out by hopefully being able to change the clip. Why is it doing this to me? Hang on just a second. I have not done a virtual training in like a minute, so I apologize. Please be patient with me. Um, mm, Come on now, go away. Why is it not? It,
I think I have it, Megan. Do you have it up? I have it up. Do you want me to put it in the chat?
Sorry, what? You have what?
The presentation. Did you say you cut and paste?
Oh no, I was talking about 211
Oh,
schedule.
sorry. Okay. Never mind.
I'm having trouble advancing my presentation. I'm sorry. Give me just a second.
No, you're totally fine.
Okay. Let me stop share and then share again and try that. Why is it not advancing? Okay, there we go. Now I'm clicking with pass. Okay, so here is the overview of the content we're going to discuss today. I'm going to do a Hope Harbor introduction. I'm sure there are probably some of you in here who are very familiar with Hope Harbor, but just in case there's anyone in here who's not, I think it's important for you to have that knowledge base so you can refer folks over to us. And then we're just going to dive right in and talk about the scope of the issue of sexual violence. What does it look like? What is encompassed under that term? And how does that impact the people who experience it? And we'll move on and talk about sexual violence in confinement. So I'll go ahead and tell you now that Hope Harbor does serve incarcerated clients. So we work with a lot of folks who either experience sexual violence in confinement or have experienced sexual violence at some point in their life and now are in confinement. And we'll talk about kind of how that impacts their trauma and their healing from that experience. We're also going to talk about human trafficking. I want to give a big disclaimer that the concept of human trafficking is broad and vast, and you could do hours and hours and hours of training on it and not encompass the totality of the issue. So my goal is to kind of give you a primer and draw a through line through all of these topics and kind of connect them together. So this is by no means meant to be a complete education on either sexual violence in confinement or human trafficking. And then we're going to talk about power and how power plays into these things, how it relates to violence and how that, again, impacts survivors. And then we'll end out with just discussing a trauma-informed approach to working with folks who have experienced these things. If at any point you have a question for me, there will be title cards at the end of each section that are held specifically for questions. So if you could just hang on to it until the end of each section, unless it's really impacting your ability to understand what I'm saying. If there's some kind of technical issue or you really don't understand what I'm saying, please go ahead and ask. But otherwise, I do have built-in sections for questions. With that said, I did include some activities, and I have a couple of just general discussion questions sprinkled throughout the presentation. And the reason I did that is I think it is helpful to comprehension for us to kind of discuss a little bit. If at any point you don't feel comfortable discussing, or this is a topic that maybe hits a little close to home for you, that I totally understand, not asking you to share any personal experiences or anything like that. The questions that I'm asking are kind of general overview questions. I would love if you could just give me a little bit of input on those. Okay, well, that was my before we start primer that I just said, so we're going to move on. And we'll again start with Hope Harbor. So this is our main office here in Bowling Green. We are the state designated rape crisis center that covers the Brad region. There are 13 rape crisis centers that cover the entirety of the state, and we are one of them. Our mission is to empower and support anyone who's ever been impacted by sexual trauma. And what that means is there's no set timeline on when people must come to us to qualify for services or what their sexual trauma looks like. So we try to break down all of the barriers that keep people from seeking help and from seeking support by not putting too many restrictions on the services that we provide. We have we have 3 office locations, one here in Bowling Green, which is here at the top, a second in Glasgow, which is just off the square. If you know where the parking structure is off the square, we're right next to that. And then one in Franklin. The one in Bowling Green and in Glasgow are walk-in ready facilities, meaning that they're staffed and can open our doors to walk-ins at any time, Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. But the Franklin location is by appointment only. And the reason for that is it's a single office space inside of I think it's a Graves Gilbert clinic. The doctor who works in that facility was very gracious to give us one of his empty office spaces. And we have that office so that if we have a client who's coming from Franklin or from maybe somewhere in rural Allen County, and it's closer for them to get to Franklin than it is to get to Bowling Green, it kind of cuts down on some of those transportation barriers that keep people from seeking services. So typically we have a therapist there about 1 day a week, but if we have a larger caseload in that area, that can bump up, or it might bump down if we have fewer people at a certain time seeking services there. As I said, we serve the 10 county region, so Allen, Barron, Butler, Edmondson, Hart, Logan, Metcalfe, Monroe, Simpson, and Warren counties. I do want to stress, though, that the services I'm about to share with you are provided statewide. So every single county in the state has a rape crisis center that represents it. This is the map of the breakdown of rape crisis centers. You can also access this map by going to KSAP.org. KSAP is the Kentucky Association of Sexual Assault Programs. They oversee and assist all the rape crisis centers across the state. Their web address is in the document sheet the sources sheet that I gave Megan this morning. So you should have an easy time accessing that. But honestly, if you Google Kentucky sexual assault, they'll come right up. When you get to their website, this map is actually interactive. So if you were to, this is just a clip, but if you were to hover over Hope Harbor's region, it would pull up our contact information in our website, and it does that for all 13 centers. So maybe you're helping someone who is in Louisville or you're helping someone who is in Paducah. You can very easily look up and find the contact information for the Rape Crisis Center that covers that area. Okay, so every Rape Crisis Center provides more or less the same services. And the reason for that is that most of our services are mandated by law. I break our services down into two categories. The first is community-based services. You are currently experiencing one of our community-based services, which are professional development trainings. We also do resource referrals, very similar to the work that you folks do. And honestly, a lot of times we're referring them straight to you. We also do community outreach. I'm sure you've seen us at community events. We try to get out into the community and raise awareness about the services that we provide so that folks know about Hope Harbor and what their rights are and how they can access us before they ever need us, right? We also have a whole team dedicated to education and prevention. If you've ever heard of Green Dot or Green Dot trainings, our team implements those locally. They also do a lot of work in the schools, providing age-appropriate information for students about internet safety, bodily autonomy, and how to seek help if something happens to them, and a lot more beyond that as well. We also do some education programs in the community, so we've done Community Green Dot or similar things like that. And the idea there is if we have an informed community, then maybe we can prevent violence from ever happening. Right. The final community service that I always highlight is our volunteer program. So we are unique in Kentucky Rape Crisis Centers in that we have a very large volunteer base. We have the largest volunteer base out of all of the other centers. Most centers have like 2 to 5. We generally have somewhere between 20 and 30 volunteers at any given time. Those volunteers will help us with all manner of activities, including direct client services, which we'll talk about in just a minute. I always tell folks that our volunteers are honestly no different than a staff advocate. They receive the same training, they go through the same background checks, they are held to the same standards. They're just better people than us because they do the work for free. Now, our second type of service is direct client service. I broke these down into 4 basics. I really want to stress that when we're working with a client, we will do our best to meet their needs, even if they are unique or have special circumstances. So just because we have these 4 categories of services doesn't mean that we're not going to work with someone if they have a special need or a specific need. But generally speaking, these are the 4 types of direct client service. The first is our 24/7 support hotline. The number is there on the screen. It'll also be at the very end on my title card. If you look up Hope Harbor, this is the number that comes up. This number is 24/7, and when we say 24/7, we mean it. If somebody calls us at 3 o'clock in the morning on Christmas Eve, there will be someone to answer that phone. It's also open to the public. So we do work with a lot of folks in crisis. People will call us in the immediate aftermath of an assault and tell us something has happened to them or be seeking information or support or guidance about what they should do. We also work with people who maybe something happened to them several years ago or a while ago, and they're just now coming to terms with, I'm struggling with this and I need some help. We also talk with a lot of people who are just looking for resource referrals, information. To be quite honest with you, we get a not insignificant number of calls looking for Hope House. So it's a mixed bag. We get all different types of calls on that hotline. But the point is, it's available at all times for survivors so that they don't have to feel alone, even if they're not ready to reach out for in-person services or to report or to go seek medical care or anything like that. Our next type of direct client service is emergency advocacy. Emergency advocacy is kind of my bread and butter. So I oversee emergency advocacy, legal advocacy, and the hotline here at Hope Harbor. And I feel very strongly that this is one of the fundamental programs or one of the fundamental services that we provide. When a survivor of sexual violence goes to an area hospital seeking post-assault care, meaning that they have been sexually assaulted, they go to the hospital and they say, I have been sexually assaulted, please help me. It is a state law in Kentucky that that hospital must then turn around and call their local rape crisis center. So they must call us in this region. And we in turn have to dispatch an advocate to offer emergency advocacy services to that survivor in the emergency room. Now, all services at Hope Harbor are at the discretion of the survivor, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But typically we find that if we go in person, introduce ourselves, and explain why we're there, we find that people are very willing to have a support person in the room with them. Our role during emergency advocacy is to provide emotional support, material support, and informational support. So, um, a lot of times when survivors are in that moment, they don't know what they should do next. They don't have a clear understanding of what their rights are. Maybe they're not even sure what reporting or what seeking medical care will look like. So the advocate's job is to provide them with all of that information and then to help them make choices for themselves that serve them best. So sometimes that looks like walking in and talking with a survivor who at the beginning of the conversation says, I don't want to report. I don't trust police. I don't want to be alone with them. And then the advocate can say, oh, well, if you would like to talk to the police, I can stay in the room with you and help you with that process. And then towards the end of the conversation, the survivor decides, okay, if I don't have to do it alone, if you can be here with me, I will go ahead and do that. I will report to law enforcement. Or sometimes it's the reverse. A survivor will say, well, I have warrants and I'm really afraid that the hospital is going to call the police. I don't want to report this. I just want to make sure that my body is okay and that I don't get sick or pregnant or have any lingering injuries from this experience and I want to go home. We can make sure that survivors know that they have the right to choose whether or not they want to report their sexual assault and that they don't have to have police contact if they don't want to. So trying to make that whole traumatic experience of seeking help in the first place easier for survivors is the point of emergency advocacy. We meet people where they're at and try to help them navigate, usually within the first 24 to 96 hours after their assault, navigate that really difficult and confusing time. The third direct client service that we provide is legal advocacy. So I don't know if any of you have ever had the misfortune of trying to navigate the criminal justice system in the United States, but it is confusing and it is not set up to support victims. Right? The point of the criminal justice system is to uphold the laws and to prove whether or not someone has broken a law and then punish them accordingly. There's not a lot of room in there to support the victims of crime. And that's not the fault of the people who work in the criminal justice system. It's just the way that the system is set up. And so as advocates, we try to help smooth out that road for survivors who do choose to report and walk with them through each step. So whether that's going with them to apply for an emergency protective order or going to court with them, kind of similar, I'm sure Brass talked about this with you as well, going to court with them so they don't have to face their abuser alone, so that we can answer questions about the language and jargon that's used in court, so that we can make sure they feel supported and don't have to walk into that space alone. Our legal advocates will stick with survivors. I mean, their cases sometimes take years. So a lot of times our legal advocates are working with a client for 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 years before their case is resolved. So that's more long-term relationship. And then finally, our last direct client service is crisis and therapeutic counseling. So we break it into crisis counseling and therapeutic counseling for a very specific reason. When we're talking about crisis counseling, we're talking about immediate crisis intervention that anyone who has received the 40-hour training from Hope Harbor, the advocacy training, can do. That's more of a de-escalation approach to crisis, getting people to a level and calm place so that they can then work and process towards healing or reporting or whatever their next goal is. Whereas therapeutic counseling is a long-term relationship between a member of staff with a counseling or social work degree, where they'll focus exclusively on the impact of sexual trauma on that person's life, well-being, continued plans and goals in the future. That relationship tends to be much longer. We have clients who come to us for maybe 3 months or 6 months. We have some clients who've been coming to us for therapeutic counseling for years and probably will always have some form of relationship with a counselor here because of the nature of their trauma. So I really want to stress through all of these direct client services that we are always providing these services for free. There's never any cost to the survivor at any point in time. We don't take insurance. We don't even need to know their real name because we never are trying to extract payment from them. Services from a rape crisis center are also confidential, and that's another state law. When a survivor is seeking support from us, unless they tell us that they're going to hurt themselves or someone else, or it falls under mandatory reporting statutes in Kentucky. So there's ongoing child abuse, neglect, or vulnerable adult abuse and neglect. Outside of those circumstances, anything that is shared with a rape crisis advocate stays with us unless the survivor gives us express written permission to share that. that is really the core of what we do because there are not a lot of other institutions that can provide that total and complete confidentiality for the survivor. And I find that a lot of survivors need that in order to have a safe place to process what has happened to them before they can move on and work with other systems or seek other supports or anything like that. So always free and always confidential. Now, in order to qualify for our services, there really are not a lot of rules, as I kind of alluded to earlier. Essentially, if someone tells us that they qualify for our services, we are going to believe them. We don't investigate, we don't require proof, we don't require a police report or anything like that. A survivor could come to us after an acute assault, meaning someone who has been sexually assaulted recently, or it could be after a delayed disclosure. So, someone who was sexually assaulted at any point in time in the past and now is choosing to come forward and seek support. I always tell people whether it has been 3 days or 30 years since your assault, you qualify for services at Hope Harbor. You can come and see us. We also work with what we would call a secondary victim or a secondary survivor. So, what that means is someone who is a support person or loved one or has experienced immense impact even though they are not the person who experienced sexual violence. So, a good example of a secondary victim that we might work with is the parent, non offending parent of a child who's been sexually assaulted. A lot of times, those parents need support services and therapeutic counseling so that they can be their best selves to help their child heal. We work with partners or friends or family members, sometimes even other professionals in the field who are working with or have witnessed a particularly gruesome situation. Our services are open to them so that no one has to experience the secondary trauma alone. Finally, in terms of qualifying for services, we work with everyone. It doesn't matter their age, it doesn't matter their gender, and it does not matter their history. I find that people sometimes get confused by this because we do work with, again, incarcerated people, and we recognize that there's a possibility that we could serve someone who has committed sexual violence or enacted sexual harm at some point in time. We stand by the belief that no one deserves to experience sexual violence, no matter who they are, what they've done, or what their background is. And so, in order to stand by that belief, we have to offer services and support to people who may have caused harm in the past. With that said, we would never serve someone or provide services to someone in relation to an accused crime. So if they're coming to us and saying, "Well, I've been accused of committing sexual harm, but I'm innocent," we're not gonna engage with that. So, in terms of qualifying for services, just remember we do not require payment, insurance. We also don't require any form of commitment. Survivors can come and go from our services as they please. If they try therapy for two sessions and decide it's not for them, that's okay. We don't require a police report except in those mandatory report situations. We also don't have to know the entire narrative or the entire story of what happened to someone. We want survivors to share with us as they feel safe and ready to do so. And it's not important to us to have all of those details, except for sometimes our legal advocates have to know a little bit more just so they can help answer questions accurately and explain things that are happening. Survivors can seek services from us at any point in time in their healing journey, and the length of that service is determined. I hope you can't hear that. It's very loud outside my window here. The length of that service is determined by the survivor in partnership with either the advocate that they're working with or the therapist. So we don't have a prescribed amount of time that someone has to commit to us or come and see us. And survivors can also continue other therapy services while they're in therapy with Hope Harbor. The reason for that is we are only focused on that sexual trauma. We're not going to talk about other things that people might seek therapy for. And because we don't require insurance, their insurance company doesn't even have to know. So they're not going to lose out on a therapeutic relationship elsewhere just because they want to seek specific services for this experience. Okay.
I have a question.
Sure.
So I've had a couple of 211 calls where it's a domestic violence survivor, and this has happened at least two, maybe three times where it's an ongoing issue, and they're kind of like they're not in immediate danger because they're staying with a sister or something like that, but they're needing legal help, and in both of these scenarios that I'm thinking of, they say that the abuser has already gone to legal aid. And so once they're established with legal aid, if the victim tries to go to legal aid, they'll see it as a conflict of interest because they're
Yep.
opposing parties and they don't want to have anything to do with them. So I'm just kind of wondering, like, Is that something that you guys help with, or at least point them in the right direction? Because some of these women, it's like they just, or not just women, obviously it can be both genders, but you just feel bad because their hands are so tied because the abuser has just done everything to where they can't even move. So, what do you
Yes,
advise?
absolutely. So we have a member of our team who is we call her our service coordinator. Sheila is her name. Sheila will be assigned to a case like that where she will work with the client to identify those other community resource possibilities to kind of circumnavigate that issue with. We also experience that quite frequently with legal aid. So I don't do that work as much, so I can't necessarily speak to the specific steps that Sheila would take in that situation, but we do have a process in place to help address that, and someone who can be specifically dedicated to, okay, this is not going to work, and so how can we work around this blockage or this barrier to get you equivalent help? Does that kind of answer your question? Okay.
Yeah, I was just, wondering. I assume you guys had something in place, but I'm never sure what to advise somebody when they're like, I can't afford to hire someone and I've already been to legal aid and they're already representing him because he's claiming he's a victim or something along those lines. So thank you.
I will say sometimes we are able to, and sometimes being not always, we're able to identify like a lawyer who would be interested in working pro bono or taking on the case at a reduced rate. Our legal advocates try to facilitate those relationships in the community. So we try to work in that direction. It's not always possible, but generally speaking, we're not going to just say, oh, well, you can't access legal aid, so there's really nothing else for you. We're going to look and work and try to find some other way, some other solution for that person. So it's not always easy, but we will work at it. Okay, couple of things I really want to highlight, and these are just common misconceptions about Hope Harbor and what we do. First and foremost, at no point in time can someone come to our offices and have any form of medical care, nor will we do any form of evidence collection here at Hope Harbor. If someone wants medical care or evidence collection, meaning that some people call it the rape kit, the sexual assault forensic exam, or anything along those lines, they must go to a Kentucky emergency room. We do not have a nurse or doctor on staff. We are not equipped to provide that care, and we do not participate in evidence collection or investigations of any kind. So some people will well-meaningly send survivors directly to us for care, and we can't provide that here. I will say if someone does need, especially medical care, or if they're interested in evidence collection, they can go to the hospital and receive that care for free. So even if they are not insured or they have kind of not great insurance, the state picks up the bill for that post-assault care because it's a law that no survivor can carry the burden of that post-assault care cost. We also do not provide batter intervention services. I know that that's a need in this community, and it's kind of hard to find if someone is looking for that service. That's not something that Hope Harbor can provide. We also do not have a shelter. This is a big way that we differentiate from BRASS, from Barren River Area Safe Space. We do not have shelter capacity. We don't house people here at our facility. Occasionally, for active clients or like safety situations, we're able to put someone in a hotel for a few days, but they have to be someone who has experienced sexual violence that we're working with at the hospital or is fleeing an unsafe situation. And honestly, a lot of times what we're doing is we're housing them for a couple of days, in the hopes that BRASS will open up and give them a longer term stay place to be. And finally, again, I want to stress that we do not provide services for the accused. I think sometimes people see that we're going into the jails and think that that's the case, and it's not. If there is someone who is coming to Hope Harbor for services and it's then later revealed that they are and they're coming to us for services where they are themselves a victim, and it is later revealed that they are implicated as the perpetrator against another person who is also seeking services at Hope Harbor, we would probably refer them out to a different center. So we would send them to Adonta or to Silverleaf or maybe to Owensboro, so that they could still have access to the services, but that we were not experiencing a conflict of interest, because we don't ever want to create a feeling that it's not safe to be here, or that we're working with someone who has caused harm directly to one of our clients. So that's really on a case-by-case basis, and we would try to identify the best way to make sure that person still has services, but there's no way that they're ever going to run into the person that they have harmed in the past. Okay, so other questions about Hope Harbor or the services that we provide?
I have another question.
Sure.
Um, so when we did our brass training, they talked about needing to, from a legal standpoint, needing to report within your own county, like the county where it happened, and that being a thing. And so I feel like you also see people that need help getting like transportation to a shelter, or they want to just get as far away as possible. So, I mean, obviously it's a 211 call, so it's not like long-term case management, but what would you advise in situations where someone's just trying to get far away or
Yeah.
like you need transportation to get out, I guess.
Transportation and housing, as I'm sure you're acutely aware, are two of the largest needs in our community that are not adequately met. I will say that we occasionally will have the funds to get an Uber for someone or to help, like if they're looking for a bus ticket. We've helped people with bus tickets like across the state or out of state in the past, but it's really a case by case basis. Um, if someone has chosen to report, I want to revisit kind of the start of your question, which was about reporting in the community where it happened. We have a lot of survivors who choose to go to seek medical care outside of their community. So especially from those rural counties, they don't necessarily want to go to their local emergency room because they probably know someone who works there or they're worried about it getting out in their community. So we see a lot of people choosing to come into um, usually into TJ Sampson in Glasgow or into either TriStar or Med Center Health here in Bowling Green. And they can still do that and then report at that location, ask for police report at that location, and usually the police will come to them. Once law enforcement is involved, they're typically it depends on the department. Sometimes they're able to provide transportation as well, but obviously, if someone doesn't want to report, then that becomes a sticky situation. We have limited funds because, like Brass, we are funded entirely, almost entirely by state and federal dollars. And so it's very restrictive what we're able to spend those dollars on. But we do have client support funds. So, again, if we can get someone an Uber or put them in a taxi or buy them a bus ticket or something like that, we try to troubleshoot that on a case by case basis. Sometimes, unfortunately, we just have to say, I'm sorry, we've hit them. There's nothing more that we can do. We can stay with you here and work with you through your experience here at the hospital or here at the police department, but we are tapped out in terms of resources. Sometimes if we're at the hospital, we'll also work with hospital social services, and sometimes they have a little bit more flexibility maybe to assist in those things, or they have more programs that they can rely on. But it's up against the fact that transportation is not really accessible in this area outside of Bowling Green city limits. So that's not a great answer to your question, but other questions?
Can y'all hear me?
Mhm.
Okay, this is the first time I've ever like talked on this computer, so
Yeah.
I did, Janine, and anyone else, I just kind of wanted to add, I used to be a rural hospital social worker, and sometimes like when patients, of course, you would have to come seek medical care, so they would have to be okay with that. But when we would have patients that would come to the hospital, and then when it was time to leave, if they didn't have anywhere to go or any type of like, or if they had a place to go but no transportation to get there, sometimes we could call the police department, and they wouldn't require them to make a report, and they would just transport them. So I think it really depends. Of course, that's like rural, so probably Bowling Green police probably wouldn't do that, but like in a smaller town, usually the case management at the hospital will know, like, okay, we don't have Ubers, we don't have
Yeah.
anything else, so we kind of have to. And we bought bus tickets and things like that too. So hospital case managers, like Mallory said, can actually do quite a bit if they're able.
Mhm. I want to piggyback off of that because I find that, like you said, our rural law enforcement is very much more likely to say, like, well, I guess we're just going to figure it out, right? I had that experience recently in Tompkinsville, actually. So it really, the important thing for us, and this is something that I work on every day, is building trusting relationships with those partners so that we can go to each other in a moment of, we are running out of options. What do we do? And troubleshoot it together and try to rely on each other. So, that's why I did not include this because it's just, I was going to run out of time, but the Hope Harbor Rape Crisis Advocacy cannot happen in a silo. We have to work together with the other people who are responding to sexual assault. And we all have different roles. Like, I cannot provide medical care. I faint at the sight of blood. Like, I would not be effective. But I need I need our medical professionals to do the part that they can do. I need our law enforcement professionals to do the part that they can do. I need our social workers to do the part that they can do. And together, as long as we have those trusting relationships, we can usually troubleshoot issues as they arise and try to figure out like what is going to be the best solution for this specific issue. If we had, unlimited money, it would be very different, but that's almost never the case. So, other questions, comments, or anything along those lines? Okay. Move the slide, advance the slide. There we go. So we're going to talk now about the scope of the issue of sexual violence. I do want to stress that you could talk to 100 different survivors about their experience and you'll probably get 100 different answers. There would be some through lines, and that's what we're going to talk about today. But everyone's experience with sexual violence and the way that we all contextualize it within our lives is different. So this is kind of an overview. It's by no means meant to say like this is the hard and fast truth about sexual violence, but I do hope that it can give you kind of a foundation to work off of. So I'm going to turn this over to you guys, and I would like to hear your perspective. I've been using the term sexual violence a lot. It's an umbrella term that we use to encompass all the different ways that people employ sexual violence against others. But I'm curious just to hear, when I say the term sexual violence, what comes to mind? What do you think that is?
Rape.
Yes, rape for sure. What else?
I also think like holding sexual favors or anything over a person, like in exchange. So, oh, I'll have sex with you for drugs, or I'll have sex, or you are my wife and you have to have sex with me. Like,
Yep. I would call that coercion. Yes, absolutely. What else?
I'd say with underage victims, definitely grooming is part of that.
Yes, absolutely. We don't have time to talk about it today, but our legislature just passed a new law pertaining to grooming, and the grooming of minors specifically, in the hopes to catch it before it escalates to sexual violence. But grooming is almost always present in a lot, not just minors, in a lot of the sexual violence that Hope Harbor sees. Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to show you this first. So when I'm talking about sexual violence, you guys pulled out a lot of the different ways that sexual violence happens. This chart is not in any way a complete list, but I tried to pull out some of the ones that are maybe less thought of or less considered. So of course we have sexual abuse, sexual assault, and sexual harassment. And I think we all kind of get what that is. But there are some other types of sexual violence that people don't consider. Has anyone ever heard the term stealthing before? So stealthing refers to when two people agree to some kind of sexual contact with the understanding that there will be a form of protection. So a condom or birth control or a dental dam or something like that. And either before the act begins or during the act, one of the parties removes that protection, so takes the condom off, or has not been, has been poking holes in it, or maybe has not been taking their birth control and has been telling their partner, oh yeah, I've been taking my birth control, or I'm on the shot, or whatever. And then that results in a problem for the other person who's involved in the sexual contact. So essentially, we agreed to sexual contact in these terms, and you violated these terms, and now my life is impacted. I've caught an STD, I've become pregnant, something along those lines. Stealthing was not something that was considered really at all to be sexual violence up until the last maybe 5 years. California actually has a law around stealthing. I think it's a civil law where someone could, go after a person who essentially lied to them on the terms of their consensual agreement. So I pull out stealthing because I want to show the ways that sexual violence is ever evolving. Our understanding of sexual violence is ever evolving. And it's really hard for anyone to put sexual violence in a specific box. Another thing that we've really seen on the rise in the last couple of years, especially with, of course, the rise of the internet, but specifically the rise of artificial intelligence, is image-based abuse. So essentially, some of these AI tools, and I'm not a computer scientist, so bear with me. But essentially, some of these AI tools can take even just a couple of video clips or images of a person and generate pornographic images or videos, or place a person's face into an already existing pornographic image or video, and that can be used as a tool of coercion, of harassment. It can be used as a tool in stalking. It's something that could be, put out into the public eye. It can really impact a person, even if they've never engaged in, or they've never filmed themselves, or they don't already have sexually graphic material out there. So this has become a big issue and will continue to be a big issue. I think just as those tools get better and better and detection gets harder and harder, it's a real problem, especially for material that involves children. So I'm not going to talk about every single one of these. Is there a term on this list that is not familiar to you that you want me to go over quickly? Okay, we can.
I'm kind of familiar with revenge porn,
Mhm.
but what I'm thinking is like people posting videos of sex or like nudity that they had in a relationship, and then somebody is that correct?
Yes, yes. I will say revenge porn and image-based abuse are kind of merging at this point because people will create revenge porn using AI, and that the umbrella term there is kind of becoming image-based abuse. But I pull out revenge porn because a lot of times it is material that was created consensually, and then the relationship ends, and then that's used to abuse the former partner, whether that's posting it online or coercively holding it over their head, like we discussed earlier, to extract something from them. So that can be a really big issue for survivors, especially when they know that, oh, my abusive partner has this material. What are they going to do with it? When is that shoe going to drop, essentially?
And the other question is, sexual trafficking is, again, human trafficking is such a broad category, but that's sometimes I get sexual trafficking and coercion confused or
Sure.
kind of enmeshed, because is sexual trafficking the selling of, and but isn't that also coercion
Mm-hmm. Yes.
to a
Yes.
degree? I'm not like, what is that definition?
Yeah, so we're going to talk a lot more about sex trafficking as we get further down into the presentation. So I can answer that a little bit better later. But the other point that I wanted to make that you're kind of making right now is that a lot of these types of sexual violence are interconnected, right? So stealthing and sexual harassment and image-based abuse can be facets of the coercion that causes a survivor to be trapped in a sex trafficking scheme, or that a trafficker would use to control their victim. So a lot of these things are interrelated, and really one can't exist, but sometimes doesn't exist without the other, if that makes sense. So the other point that I wanted to make, and I'm not a big like let's read the law and dissect it person, but I wanted to just show you when we're talking about charging sexual violence in Kentucky, it's not as easy as just saying, oh, there's this whole, umbrella or cloud or group of different types of sexual violence that can happen, and we just need to really describe what happened and we can charge any old thing that happens. When we're talking about pressing charges against a person who has caused harm, we have to fit the crimes that they committed or the harm that they committed into a box so that they can be moved through that process and charged appropriately. So when we're talking about rape specifically, there are very specific guidelines for what qualifies as rape. And in Kentucky, we have two charges. We have rape charges and sodomy charges. Sodomy refers to anal penetration, and rape refers to vaginal penetration. So technically, a man who is raped in Kentucky his perpetrator cannot be charged with rape because it was sodomy. You probably get a sodomy charge instead. Um, there are lots of systemic and historical reasons for that. And I'm not necessarily right, wrong, or indifferent about it, but just to demonstrate that just because sexual violence is nebulous and ever evolving, that doesn't mean that our laws are ever evolving, right? So there are lots and lots and lots of standards that an assault has to fit into, or that law enforcement has to prove occurred in order for someone to even get charged. And unfortunately, what that often means is perpetrators either take a plea deal or they don't end up being charged, or there's not enough proof to bring charges in the first place. Um, which is a big issue for survivors for obvious reasons, but also because they usually have worked through the whole process and consented to evidence collection and participated in all the court hearings and all of these things just to get to the finish line and not get that justice that they're seeking. So we can all agree that sexual violence is this nebulous web of things that are all interrelated, but the law doesn't necessarily work that way, and that can be really damaging for survivors. So that's a lot of times why people choose not to report. Okay, so I have a couple of statistics. I'll go through them quickly. This first one is specific to Kentucky, and I took it from the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey from 2023 and 2024. 390,000 Kentucky women report having experienced attempted or completed rape in their lifetime. So this is obviously a really huge issue in our community and across the world. In the United States, 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 13 boys are estimated to have experienced sexual abuse before they reach adulthood. And that comes from the National Children's Alliance. And then 60% of sexual assaults are committed by someone that the survivor knows. I almost always include this statistic because I think a lot of people think of sexual violence as date rape, or you're snatched up in the back of a white van and driven out to the desert or something like that. And that does happen. I'm not saying it doesn't, but the vast majority of sexual violence occurs between people who have a relationship already, whether that's intimate or family or whatever. There's some form of connection there, and we'll talk about why that is later. And then 54% of sexual violence survivors were victimized between the ages of 18 and 34. So this is a lot of times something that is happening to young people, and either as children or in their early adulthood. Now, with that said, I do find this statistic to cause some issues with the way that we conceptualize survivors, and we'll talk about that later, because sexual violence happens to everyone, right? It's not a problem that applies to only one set of people. So I think statistics are a really good foundational point to kind of jump off of when we're talking about what is the scope of this issue. But statistics are flawed, and I like to talk about kind of why that is. So I would love to hear from you. What are your thoughts about, why might these statistics be a little bit unreliable or a little bit flawed?
I'll go first. I think because your ability to, or your confidence in reaching out for resources, is largely a privilege that everybody doesn't have. So if you are, an immigrant who's come here and you're not legal, but your spouse is, I've seen that a lot in working with diverse, populations. So the male in the home is legal, he has papers, mom is here illegally and will endure significant abuse. And then when any type of resources are suggested, she's terrified because her kids are here. And if she can't go. I mean, she doesn't have legal recourse or anything. So she just is stuck in a situation. And a lot of it, sometimes I've also seen cultural, where there's just a cultural pressure that women don't leave a situation. So where would you even go? It's like not even fathomable for some populations to even think about leaving, let alone actually come up with a plan and have the resources to implement.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you hit the nail on the head, right? So when we're thinking about collecting data, almost all of this data is either speculative based on smaller data sets, or it's based on reporting numbers that are provided by systems and institutions. Well, the vast majority of sexual assault that occurs is never reported. It's not something that anyone ever even speaks about to begin with. So it's basically impossible for us to have correct or accurate data sets. So the data that we do have, although it's almost always with the best intentions and with the best possible resources, we have to talk about it with the understanding that it probably is not actually capturing the totality of the problem. So I have a whole list of some of those barriers, and you hit on a lot of them here as you were answering my question. These are some of the common barriers that I hear when I'm talking to survivors about, why they maybe feel like they don't want to, or they can't, or they're not safe enough to to choose to report or choose to seek help of any kind, even not just going to law enforcement, but seeking help from any kind of institution, including Hope Harbor. I put as number one the fear of not being believed. I think that's one of the biggest things that I hear from survivors all the time is that they're worried that what happened to them, does it even qualify as sexual violence? Was it actually rape, or am I just mad at this person, or am I just drunk, or did something happen that I can't remember? Also the fear that they are going to suffer some kind of recourse because of a system. So whether that's, like you said, they are here without citizenship or without documentation, they're worried about deportation or facing the ever mounting ramifications of that. Or they have a warrant out maybe, or they have been arrested many, many times and are worried about continued police contact. Another thing we see really often, and I say this with the utmost respect for our medical partners, I work with a lot of people who have no trust or feel any sort of safety in a medical setting. They've had negative experiences with hospitals and doctors and nurses and whoever, and they just don't feel safe in that space. So taking a very intimate issue and bringing it to a space where they don't feel safe is a ask for them. I'm not going to talk through all of this, and we'll talk about kind of the social aspect of sexual violence here in a little bit, but a lot of people are afraid of the social backlash. What is going to happen when my family finds out? What is going to happen when my community finds out? Another thing we see all the time is what I would classify as fatigue or exhaustion. So someone has experienced sexual violence, and a lot of times this is coming where they've experienced it multiple times across their life, and they just do not have the mental fortitude at this time to go through the long process of seeking help. That's why we are so committed to breaking down the barriers that keep people from seeking help in the first place. Because for a lot of folks, reporting is not easy. Seeking help at the hospital is not easy. You're asked 10,000 questions and you have to bare your soul to all these different people that you don't know and maybe don't feel safe around, with the understanding that there could be some way that this falls back on you. So there are tons and tons of reasons on this list. And again, we won't go through all of them, but just thinking about all of these reasons, this is why so many people never come forward. This is why the majority of the people that Hope Harbor serves are delayed reports, who something happened to them either as a child or as a young adult. And now, for whatever reason, they're ready to seek help or they're ready to talk about it. So people get, I think, sometimes frustrated with the idea that someone is choosing not to report or choosing not to do anything about what happened to them. And I really find that hard to stomach, because there are so many reasons why someone might choose not to do what we think is best or what might be in their best interest, because we don't have the capacity to understand the barriers that they might be facing. Okay, well, I've been teasing this concept and I love to talk about this when I do presentations. There is a social imagination around sexual violence. So I'm going to show you this slide. I'm a huge Criminal Minds fan. I have been a huge Criminal Minds fan for years. It's my guilty pleasure show. But shows like Criminal Minds and Law and Order SVU and NCIS and CSI and all of those have really contributed to the social imagination around sexual violence, who experiences sexual violence, and what happens afterward. And that informs the way that advocates and perpetrators and survivors and the general community move through and around this problem. So I picked this particular victim from season 1, episode 5 of Criminal Minds. Her name's Cheryl Davenport. Her sister is abducted and raped, and then she is also being targeted by the same perpetrator in the show, in the episode. And I picked her because I think that she encapsulates a lot of what a lot of what our social imagination expects survivors to look like. She's young, she's pretty, she's white, she's, conventionally attractive, and she comes from an affluent family. You can't really see that in the picture. So I think that people tend to imagine that sexual violence targets people who are a little bit vulnerable to it, but also people who are seen by the general public to be desirable for whatever reason, right? But the reality of the situation is, as I've said earlier, that sexual violence happens to everyone. It does happen to people who are like the fictional character, but it also happens to people who are in jail. It happens to people who are perceived to have a lot of power and should be able to protect themselves. It happens to people who engage in sex work. It happens in communities, as you hit on a little bit earlier, where they do not culturally or for religious reasons or whatever necessarily even choose to talk about this as an issue. It happens to the elderly, it happens to children. So we are kind of hamstrung by this social imagination where we think that there's a specific type of person that sexual violence impacts, when the reality is that it happens to everyone. And the same is true for perpetrators. So this is an image of Tim Curry as a character in Criminal Minds season 5, episode 3. This is one of my all-time favorite episodes, partially because Tim Curry is a fantastic actor. He plays in this, it's a 2-parter or maybe even a 3-parter. He plays this just deplorable, socially isolated, gross, scary man who abducts and sexually violates people and commits murder, right? In this episode, Tim Curry literally drives around in a white van and abducts people. I find that a lot of times when we're talking about sexual violence, this is the type of perpetrator that we're imagining. A person who is socially isolated, is, undesirable, is not part of our community, and is an outsider that we should fear. But the reality is that perpetrators can also be anyone. Perpetrators can be those people like Billy Flynn, but it can also be leaders in our community. They can be someone who the survivor deeply loves and trusts. It can be someone who, you know, doesn't necessarily seem to have the power or the physical ability to overpower another person and enact violence. It doesn't matter. Anybody can commit sexual violence and anyone can be the victim of sexual violence. And if we can train our brains to remember that fact and not get hung up on that pernicious social imagination that we see reflected in television and movies and media and beyond, we would have a better understanding or be better equipped to contend with the scope of the problem of sexual violence. So I'm going to move on now and just quickly, post-assault considerations. So I know that sometimes people immediately call Hope Harbor after they've experienced an assault, but I would assume that there's a possibility that they could also call 211. Our hope is that you would send them to us, right? Like you would refer them to us, connect them with our 24/7 hotline. But I can imagine scenarios where someone is in a super heightened state and they're not necessarily ready to, oh, you've called a different number, you need to call this number and they'll help you. That's not always received well from someone who is in trauma. So I did want to just share a couple of things to consider if you find yourself unable to get them to call another line and you're needing to provide survivors with just some basic information about what their options are. The first thing you want to consider is this person safe? If they're not safe, then follow whatever processes 211 has in place to get them to safety or to advise them on how to get to safety. The next thing they may want to consider is, do they need medical attention? And remember that post-assault care is free in Kentucky, so they can go to any hospital and seek that and not be charged. And the next thing they may want to consider is, do they want to report? I want to remind you that unless it's a mandatory report situation, there's no pressure either way. Someone can choose to report or not. If they want to report, they may want to consider preserving any evidence that might either be in their car, in their home, or on their person. The post-assault evidence collection a lot of times is really focused on the forensic evidence exam, or the SAFE exam is what the acronym is. That can be collected. It's usually mostly documentation of injuries and any DNA evidence that may remain on the survivor's body. There's generally a 96-hour window after the assault for that evidence to be collected. So if that's something that someone wants, they do need to move towards going to an emergency room to have that collected reasonably quickly, because otherwise, especially the DNA evidence will degrade quickly and not be collectible. And then beyond that, do they need support for healing and reporting? That's something that Hope Harbor can do. Okay. So again, ideally and in a perfect world, you would send them to us and we would do all of this, right? But there may be a circumstance where that's just not feasible, or the person's in such a heightened state that you can't get them to take a different number or call a different person, in which case, just keep these things in mind. And I did send the slides to Megan so she can give those to the team if she hasn't already. A couple things to remember about reporting, and I will buzz right through these. First of all, survivors have the right to choose unless it's a mandatory report situation. Used to many years ago in Kentucky, there were DV laws. So if it was a domestic violence report, police had to be involved. That's no longer the case. It's very important that survivors report when and if they ever become ready to do so, because the process is so arduous and can be such a difficult experience for someone to have. And it, like I said earlier, takes sometimes years to get through. Survivors always have the right to choose whether or not the sexual assault forensic exam is completed. I really want to stress this because if the kit is completed on an unwilling person, that is an act of sexual violence in and of itself because it is an extremely invasive and uncomfortable procedure. We don't ever want someone to have to go through that unless they want to. They always have the right to access rape crisis advocacy, whether that's at the hospital or they can call our 24/7 number at any time. And they have the right to information and notification about their case should they choose to report. That's something that Hope Harbor and our legal advocates can help with. All right, some other red flags to keep in mind for sexual violence in adults. Disclosure is the top. If someone tells you that they've experienced sexual violence, I really encourage you to believe them because it takes a lot of bravery to voice that to literally anyone. So the choice to come forward and disclose a lot of times is a real flag that this definitely actually truly has happened. You also want to watch out for disclosures of co-occurring crimes or co-occurring violence. So if someone has disclosed domestic violence, for example, that's a co-occurring crime with sexual violence, meaning they happen concurrently or in relation to one another very frequently. So the likelihood, if someone has experienced domestic violence, the statistical likelihood that they've experienced sexual violence also increases. That doesn't mean that that's always the case. And there are lots of survivors at BRASS who will tell you that sexual violence is not part of their experience. But there are also lots of survivors that was a big part of their experience. Social isolation. So if someone is choosing to pull away from their friends, their family, their community, they're stopping doing a lot of the things that they would normally do to keep themselves happy, healthy, and safe. If they are maybe having repeated health concerns, they tell you that they have a controlling partner, parent, family member, or friend who dictates their activities, or they maybe are suddenly or having a lot of intense depression, anxiety, or other mental health concerns. There are other things on this list. Another thing I will highlight just quickly is an extreme or repeated change in appearance. I see this a lot, especially in young people. So someone who is constantly changing their hair, changing the way they do their makeup, changing their clothing, getting tattoos, getting piercings. Changes in our appearance are sometimes a try to regain control of your life and your bodily autonomy. So if you're seeing or hearing this from a person, probably you don't want to ask them, hey, have you experienced sexual violence recently? But it's just one of those red flags that tells us like something might be going on here. In children, again, disclosure and a lot of those similar things that I already listed out for adults. A couple of things I also want to highlight. If a child is experiencing bedwetting regression, meaning that they had, been potty trained and were not wetting the bed, and then kind of have an immediate or unexpected regression back into not being potty trained or wetting the bed. Sometimes that's an indicator that something has happened to them. Age inappropriate knowledge is also a big one. If a child has age inappropriate knowledge of sexual activities or sexual terms or anything like that, a lot of times that's an indicator that they've at least been exposed to sexual violence, whether it has happened to them directly or not. And if they have really emotionally intense relationships with adults. So they love their soccer coach, but it's more than just I love being coached by this person. It's I need to please this person at all times. I need to be around this person as much as possible. That's harder to identify within family structures, but when we're talking about adults of special relationship or special importance to that person that is not necessarily a family member, if they have that really intense connection, that can sometimes be a red flag. Social isolation, emotional outbursts, and then sudden avoidance of people, places, or things. We see a lot of times changes in bathroom habits, like children will avoid the bathroom entirely because a lot of times that's where the violence occurs. So I've given you these red flags because I know that people like to have something tangible to walk away from a presentation or information session with. I really want to stress, though, that someone could have none of these red flags and still have experienced this at some point. So this is not a definitive list. And someone could have all of these red flags and then have something else going on in their life that is not sexual violence related. So don't take this as the absolute hard and fast truth, but we do find that a lot of these things are sufficiently common among sexual assault survivors to call them red flags. Okay, questions about anything there? All right, so we're going to talk now about sexual violence in confinement. Why do we think that sexual violence in confinement, so in a jail or prison, would be different from sexual violence that happens in the community to people who are not incarcerated?
because the power dynamics and
Mhm.
nowhere to run, essentially.
Yes, absolutely. Because of the power dynamics of being incarcerated and the fact that they cannot leave the environment, right? So, another thing that I want to point out, and I'm gonna attempt to play a video clip. It's very short, so if you can't hear it, I included it on the resources list that I sent Megan, but I'm gonna try this. Could you guys hear that? No? Okay, all right. Well, I'm not gonna fuss with it too much, but essentially, this is a clip of an old SpongeBob episode. I don't 100% know when it aired. I was not a SpongeBob kid, so I'm not super familiar with the eras of SpongeBob. But it's a don't drop the soap joke in a children's television program. Um, if for some reason you're not aware, don't drop the soap is usually a joke about avoiding prison rape, because a lot of sexual assault in prison does happen in the shower setting. So, one of the issues with sexual violence in confinement is that we have a cultural expectation that sexual violence in confinement just happens. It's just part of being in jail, and that if you go to jail, you should expect that you're going to be exposed to sexual violence. And so much so that we joke about it, we laugh about it, and it's a joke that is so common in our culture that it makes it into children's television programming, right? Now, I don't think they would air this episode now, but this is something that we all grew up in this kind of miasma of acceptance around this topic. And so that's another reason why sexual violence in confinement is such a difficult thing to work with, because it has just been accepted as normal for so long. Every year, 200,000 adults and children, so adults who are in the care and custody of the Department of Corrections and children who are in the care and custody of the Department of Juvenile Justice, are sexually abused behind bars. About half of all assaults in adult facilities are committed by staff members. So that's guards, jailers, maybe volunteers of the, like, someone who's bringing in programming, or like doing religious services or anything like that. Any person who is either a volunteer of or employed by the facility. And then that number jumps to 80% of sexual abuse in juvenile facilities. So unfortunately, you already highlighted, Lauren, those power dynamics, right? People who are in positions of power in these facilities are making up most of the sexual violence that occurs in these spaces, right? And I really want to stress this. These statistics came from an organization called Just Detention International. They're wonderful. They have great resources. So if you want to learn more about this, I would check them out. Um, there are laws that are supposed to protect against this. We have the Prison Rape Elimination Act. That's the acronym is PREA, Prison Rape Elimination Act. It was enacted in 2003 and then expanded in 2013. And the goal is to kind of end this culture of acceptance within the prison system and standardize the institutional response and enact prevention policies. I do think that a lot of the things that PREA put in place have been good, but that does not take away the fact that sexual assault does still happen in confinement. It establishes that zero tolerance policy. And basically, the thing that you have to remember about PREA is that it is intended to uphold the Eighth Amendment rights of people who are incarcerated. So essentially, the Eighth Amendment is supposed to protect us from cruel and unusual punishment. And the PREA law says that, or codifies that, sexual violence in confinement constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. So that's why it's so important. Now, if someone wants to report while they're in confinement, they can do that in-house or through the Department of Corrections or through Hope Harbor. There should be multiple streams for them to do that, either by talking to a guard or calling out. It should be a free call to call Hope Harbor or to call the Department of Corrections to make a report. In practice, though, find that a lot of people have limited access to phones, or they're in a public forum where they have access to a phone, but there's also 10 or 15 people standing around them. So a lot of times we're finding that survivors are struggling to report. I have personally taken PREA reports for survivors who end up in one of the facilities in the Brad, but the violence occurred at a different facility outside our service area. So it's not until they move facilities and come to a new location that they feel safe enough to file that report. So there are some unique barriers to seeking help, which I've already alluded to. One of those is the belief that a relationship in confinement is consensual. So two inmates can consent to a relationship or sexual interactions between them. It'll probably be against the rules of that facility, right? But they're able to consent in that way. But inmate is not able to consent to a relationship of any kind with a person who is an employee of the facility or a volunteer of the facility. So, unfortunately, what we see a lot of times is that coercion of individuals to make themselves sexually available to a guard or to someone else who works for the facility in exchange for basic needs being met, like in exchange for an extra tray, in exchange for more time outside, in exchange for access to maybe drugs or alcohol. And so it's really easy to manipulate folks who are incarcerated because they have no real control over their lives themselves. And a lot of times they have needs that are not being met in the facility, whether that's by design or just because that facility is underfunded and understaffed and does not have the resources to meet their needs, right? A lot of times also survivors who are incarcerated are really afraid of either being placed in protective custody. So if they report that they've experienced sexual assault, a lot of times the facility will put them in solitary confinement that they call protective custody to keep them separated until they can complete an investigation. That's a long time usually. It's not a quick experience. And then they're alone, usually on like 23-hour lockup. So they get 1 hour a day out, sometimes less. So that's a huge deterrent. And then also the fear of getting transferred. I've worked with a lot of survivors who, and it's very common, especially in smaller facilities like we have here, for people to get transferred around. They just get bounced from facility to facility. People don't want to do that, especially if they have family members in this area. If someone's family is located here in Warren County and it's much easier for them to maybe visit or to put money on their books or whatever, and that person gets transferred out to Paducah or to Louisville, the likelihood that they'll have access to their family members significantly decreases. And so it's really difficult for people to justify wanting to report if they're going to face institutional consequences that are not really even meant to be consequences, but end up working that way. A lot of times transfers are to keep a person safe, but they have to make the choice between safety and getting their needs met. And a lot of times that, they're gonna prioritize getting their needs met because they have the belief that they can maybe keep themselves safe. Okay, so some of the red flags for confinement, sexual violence in confinement, all the same red flags that exist for sexual violence in the community. They're all the same. Another thing we might see is someone engaging in extreme violence as retribution or to reestablish their dominance in the culture inside the facility. So if they experience sexual violence, that word gets around a lot of times in the facility, and the person who experienced it will be subjugated to other violence because they're viewed as weak or easy to take advantage of. So they might have to engage in extreme violence as retribution, right? Or to reestablish, I'm actually very tough and you can't take advantage of me. They might also act out to obtain a transfer or to be placed in a different unit. So maybe they do want to be placed in solitary or they do want to be moved. It depends. And then participation in some other kind of crime or rule breaking inside the facility, especially where a guard is concerned. So if the example that I give here is contraband smuggling. So if an inmate is involved in a process where a guard is bringing contraband into a facility, a lot of times that's a red flag that there's some other inappropriateness in the relationship between those two. It might be sexual or it might not. Okay, just quickly, I want to read through this. I included this testimonial from someone who was incarcerated in Wisconsin for a time. This is through Just Detention International. But this is essentially a story from a man who, and I'm going to move this really quickly so that I can read it to you. Hang on just a second. Okay. Oh, go away. Okay. This is a story he goes by Willie. I'm not sure if that's a pseudonym or if that's his real name. He says, I was transferred there to Wisconsin because I had a buddy there. So I thought it was cool at first. Me and my friend were working out all the time. He was really cool with this guard named Alex. And so naturally, I started talking to the guard and I was like, oh, yeah, he is really cool. Then the guard, just started being very, very nice and letting me out later, letting me get on the phone for longer, giving me extra food. And after about a month of that, it turned into him really talking weird about sexual stuff, just probing me for weird answers. And I was like, whoa, this is getting kind of weird. Then he started bringing me tobacco and weed. I took it and was like, okay, this is cool. It was kind of weird, and he wasn't even making me pay for it. He was very friendly. Then it turned dark. There was this guy named ML. The guard, Alex, didn't like him, and he said, "This is what happens to guys that I don't like." He planted drugs in ML's cell, and that guy went to the hole, which means solitary confinement, for 120 days and then went to maximum security. He is still having problems to this day. I just looked him up. The guard that did that, or that guard did that to a couple of people. He just blatantly lied on them and told them, "Yeah, this is what happens when I don't like you." And I was like, oh, damn, I don't want him to not like me. Then one day he told me he was gay. Now, this is weird, and I'm smoking weed and getting kind of strung out on that stuff. He's giving me a lot. I don't confide in anyone. I don't let anyone know what's going on with me. I'm just really hating life because I feel like I'm in a situation where I can't win. I'm against a vindictive guard. No one's going to believe me. I'm an inmate in an all white prison with all white guards. No one's going to believe me. Then eventually he was telling me about how nice my butt is, and then he goes on to talk about experiencing sexual violence or being sexually assaulted by this guard. So I know that that is difficult to listen to, but I really think that it illustrates in a lot of ways the way that coercion can happen in these facilities. I went through and highlighted some examples. Initially, the inmate is thinking, oh, this guard is really cool. He's giving me all these things. He's letting me out later. Maybe he's talking about weird sexual stuff and being odd, but he's bringing me tobacco and weed and he's not making me pay for it. You know, this is a good relationship for me to have. And then some things take place where the inmate is saying, oh, I see that if I upset this guard or I do something that he doesn't like, he can really make my life difficult. I don't want him to not like me. So then he finds himself in this situation where he really can't win. He doesn't feel like anyone's going to believe him because the sexual advances are getting stronger and stronger. And then he says, "Oh my God, this place is going to just hang me up high," meaning it's really going to make my life difficult. Um, so you can kind of see the progression of the relationship there. This is a narrative that we see mirrored in a lot of sexual assault survivors, people who experience sexual assault in confinement. So just because someone is being nice, because there are a lot of guards who are nice people and genuinely want to do a good job and take care of the people in their care and custody, doesn't necessarily mean that they're problematic. But it's really easy for someone who has nothing to view someone who's giving them just a little bit of something as a really great person and to find themselves stuck in this web of being really, really vulnerable to abuse. Does anyone have questions for me about that piece of about confinement specifically?
This isn't a question, but just more of just an observation. When I was a long time ago, I worked at the Bluegrass Farm Worker Health Clinic, and we did a lot of migrant farm worker initiatives. And so much of what you were saying was part of our training of just like there's a whole culture of that being part of like migrant farm
Yeah.
accommodations, and there's a lot of like STDs that are passed around and then passed on to like their wives, and it's just like a
Mm.
whole thing. So there was a whole initiative about that and how it's part of culture of people being packed into tight spaces and tight accommodations, low income, and like an all male environment. It's part of the culture, I guess. So it just kind of reminded me of that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that really demonstrates like the point that I'm going to make here at the end, which is that power is kind of the through line here, right? Our migrant workers find themselves to be kind of at the mercy a lot of times of the people who employ them. Of course, our people who are our folks who are incarcerated, the inmates, are at the mercy of their guards and the people who are orchestrating their confinement. Sexual violence survivors find themselves at the mercy of the person who is committing sexual violence against them. So that power kind of weaves its way through the whole narrative here.
Yeah,
Okay.
power and control.
Yes. Yep. Absolutely. Okay. So I want to talk about human trafficking, and I am running a little bit tight on time, so I'm going to move quickly through this. But has anyone ever heard of this documentary here, The Sound of Freedom? It was really popular. It came out in, I think, 2022 or 2023. Has anybody watched it or heard of it? So I ask about that because I am not here to say that The Sound of Freedom was not an accurate representation of what some human trafficking looks like. I am positive that there's human trafficking that happens in this country and across the world that very much closely mirrors what is depicted in The Sound of Freedom. Okay. But a lot of the narratives around human trafficking are either very narrow, so only talking about a very specific type of trafficking, or are just straight up misinformation. If you're a person who's active online, I'm sure you have at some point seen one of these posts that's like, some person put a zip tie on my car, so that means that I'm being trafficked or I'm being targeted for trafficking. Watch out if somebody sends you a link because they're going to take all your information and sex traffic you. Look out if somebody, is following you around the grocery store because that means you're going to be sex trafficked. I'm not saying that that is impossible. I'm not saying that that doesn't happen. I'm not saying that that doesn't happen, but more often than not, these social media posts are just misinformation. It's an inaccurate representation of what trafficking actually looks like. I'm sure you're all familiar with this scene from the Liam Neeson movie Taken. I don't know, if you've not seen it, I'm sure you've at least seen I Will Find You and I Will Kill You, right? This movie is about an international trafficking ring where a young, beautiful woman is taken into sexual slavery. Again, I'm not saying that that doesn't happen, but if we're talking about our community here in Bowling Green, human trafficking doesn't really look like this the majority of the time. Okay. Just some quick facts about trafficking. These are taken from the Department of Homeland Security. Across the world, 27.6 million people are trafficked. The majority of that is forced labor trafficking, but 23% of it is sexual trafficking. The majority of sex trafficking victims are women and are adults. So there are not really reliable estimates or statistics that I could find that I felt confident in around human trafficking within the United States, but it has been reported in all 50 states and in the District of Columbia on all our tribal land and within U.S. territories. So it's something that is happening across the world. Again, for the same reasons that the statistics we talked about with sexual violence are not reliable, the statistics for trafficking are not super reliable. The methods of control that perpetrators of human trafficking will use, first and foremost, is force, right? So either actually physically abusing someone or sexually abusing someone, or the threat of physical or sexual abuse against a victim or possibly against their loved ones. More common, or maybe equally as common, is fraud. So a false promise of access, usually to education, employment, or financial stability, or fraud around a romantic or platonic relationship. So a partner might be trafficked by their loved one and be operating under the belief that they're consensually engaging in sex work. But their loved one is actually, or their partner, or their boyfriend is actually doing this with 6 other women, through the community, and just kind of living off of the spoils of the forced sex labor that these people are doing. And then coercion, we've talked a lot about already. It's that compelling a choice or action by force or fraud. Common tactics are withholding documents, especially for international folks. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Blackmail, sometimes that's revenge porn or other financial blackmail or social blackmail. Oh, there's a message in the chat. Okay, thanks, Megan. And then isolation. One way to really get someone to believe that they have no choice but to do what you're telling them to do is to make you the only social connection that they have in their life. So if I have a partner and that partner isolates me from my loved ones, from my family and my friends, it's really a lot easier for them to then get into my head and make me believe that I am not loved and they're the only person who loves me or will ever take care of me, and I need to do what they say. And then finally, addiction. We see addiction co-occurring within human trafficking a lot, either as a tool of control or as a condition that keeps someone from escaping that system.
I used to live in Los Angeles, and it's very, very prevalent there, and addiction, sex trafficking, and immigrant sex trafficking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm glad that you made that point, because it also illustrates like the geographical and economic and uh, community makeup of that region is different in some ways to here in Bowling Green or here in Kentucky. And so when I am saying that that kind of international drug smuggling or international human trafficking is more so sensationalized or more so something that we see in media, that doesn't necessarily apply to a community like that where you're closer to the border. There are maybe not more, but there's a larger population, and there are a lot of migrants and immigrants in that community and a lot of people who find themselves vulnerable for that specific thing. So that's not to say that our Liam Neeson story can't happen. It definitely does happen, especially in communities like that. But here in Bowling Green, there are more frequent or more common forms of trafficking that it's more important to be aware of because they more often fly under the radar, right? Okay. When we're talking about the dynamic between trafficker and survivor, I hear a lot from folks, both in like domestic violence or sexually abusive relationships, and when we're talking about trafficking survivors. Well, they have free will and they have rights. Why don't they just leave? They can just leave. If I was in that situation, I would just get up and leave. But the thing that people fail to realize is that there's almost always some kind of relationship dynamic between the trafficker and the survivor. So I already talked about romantic partners. It might also be a caregiver and a dependent. Parents will traffic their children for access to money and housing. It happens. And that's something that people a lot of times overlook because they don't know what they're looking for or they don't know that that's something that can happen. Another thing is like a boss employee. So this is more common in labor trafficking, but it can happen. And I'll show you a very specific example of that in Bowling Green. And then group leader and group member. This is really common, kind of commonly combined with romantic partners. So a trafficker will develop romantic relationships with the people that he's trafficking and then kind of pull them all together into a group. They're all aware of each other. And then they have this group member, group leader dynamic that's also interrelated with the romantic dynamic. This a lot of times involves those emotional or economic ties. So those can be inherent, like a child is economically reliant on their parent to, give them housing and food and all the things they need to stay alive. Or it can be manufactured by the trafficker through those coercion, fraud, and force techniques that we talked about earlier. Trafficking victims are often criminalized also. So when we're talking about criminalization, it can happen to any victim. It happens sometimes to sexual assault survivors. They're criminalized intentionally by their perpetrator as a way to discredit their allegation, but it is incredibly common in trafficking. So a trafficker will intentionally get a survivor into legal trouble or set them up to get into legal trouble. That will increase their dependence on the trafficker because it decreases their ability to get a job or to get housing on their own. And it also embeds this mistrust of law enforcement. So they're not going to report, they're not going to get their trafficker in trouble because they're worried that they have 3 warrants out for their arrest for prostitution or sex work or whatever the charge would be in that locality. So sex work is often the way that this is criminalized. They will get arrested or charged with prostitution. And then once that has happened once, then they kind of have that label of sex worker and it just kind of spirals down from there, makes it harder and harder and harder to come forward and say, I was not engaging with that of my own free will. Traffickers who do not choose, or trafficking survivors, excuse me, who don't then choose to rat out the person who's trafficking them, usually end up with prostitution charges, even if law enforcement suspects that trafficking is ongoing. So if they're not willing to admit that their victims are going to be charged as, they're going to be charged with prostitution and end up criminalized in that way. This is maybe the hardest thing for people to grasp. A trafficking survivor is a lot of times not going to come up to you and say, I am being trafficked, will you please help me? A lot of times survivors don't even realize that trafficking is what is happening to them. They think that they are in a loving relationship that has struggles, or they're in a partnership where they really feel strongly about their partner, but they just have bad days and that's okay because I love them. Or conversely, they are in fear of their life. They are in fear of the lives of their family. They are in fear that they will lose what little access to economic stability that they have and then end up completely destitute and with nothing. So whether they realize that they're a trafficking victim or not, the likelihood that they are going to come forward and seek help is really low. Hang on just a second. There we go. So it's hard to identify trafficking. I did put some red flags though. Lack of access or agency over their own life. Maybe they don't have their driver's license or their passport or their birth certificate. They don't have their own bank cards and money. They don't have their own car. They don't even have their own phone, right? Pulling away those tools that people use to control their own lives is a way that the trafficker makes the survivor entirely dependent on them. Again, that social isolation piece and those repeated health concerns, if they're consistently in need of medical intervention, that can be a red flag. Constant travel, so maybe they're going all over up and down I-65, or conversely, they're feeling trapped at home. They can't leave, they can't go somewhere else, they can't go out and do community activities because they have to stay at home. Overpowering fear or suspicion of systems, that's a lot of times embedded by the trafficker, as we talked about with that criminalization piece. Or they have, again, that controlling partner, parent, family member, or friend. And then finally, if they don't have a lot of personal possessions, that kind of is linked to the constant travel. If they don't have a lot of personal possessions, it's probably because the trafficker controls their personal possessions, takes things away from them, or just in some way makes it so that they don't have the things that they would need to live a comfortable, happy life. Keeping people uncomfortable, hungry, scared, and dependent on the trafficker is how they manipulate them into doing what they want. All right, I have some examples of trafficking in Bowling Green. I'm going to skip this one. It's included on the reference sheet that I sent you. But here's another example we see a lot, specifically with regard to massage parlors. It's in Bowling Green, it's happened in Glasgow, it's happened in Franklin. We see a lot of times survivors who are trafficked to this country, usually from Asia. China is pretty common, or other countries in that area, on the promise of a good job and education and a real, oh my gosh, what is going on? On the promise that they will have access to education and a real massage license. And instead, what happens is their passports get taken and they are put into a random city that they've never heard of, or they don't know where they are. They barely speak the language and they don't have access to transportation. And they're stuck in this massage parlor. They're not paid, or they're paid minimal. And they're also told, oh, you owe this massage company hundreds of thousands of dollars because we house you and we clothed you and we got you your license that isn't really real, and we paid for you to come to this country, so you have to work off your debt to us before you can leave. But they don't pay them enough to work off the debt, so they have to work off tips. And so they create this environment where women are incentivized to engage in sex work because they have no other recourse to make money to get out from under this terrible debt that is just on top of them. So that's happening in our community. Here are some examples. The BGPD shut down Star Spa. What they heard from the women who were working in there is that she was receiving minimal payment and or only making tips. They did not know what city or state they were in. And there were other people who were the employers in this case who would not be at the spa regularly, but would come. I know. Okay. But would come and pick up the money and check in on them and make sure they were doing what they were supposed to be doing and then leave. So these individuals who are named here are benefiting financially from this illegal business. This is a really good example of what human trafficking in Bowling Green actually truly looks like. The other example is good too, so I'd encourage you to check that out. Okay. So we've already talked about power. We've already also kind of answered this question, right? What is power? Power is the thing that people exert over others to extract what they want or need from them, right? Power is strength. Power is control. Power is self-determination. Power is choice. Power is agency and economic stability and independence. But I firmly believe that power and violence are inextricably linked, and that realistically, violence cannot exist without taking advantage of an unequal power dynamic. All forms of violence are in some way about power, whether that's exerting power, I'm going to physically harm you, or taking power away, I'm going to take your choices away and make you do for me what I want you to do, right? So a really good example of this is drug facilitated sexual assault. A lot of people think that roofies are the most commonly used drug in drug facilitated sexual assaults, and that is not true. Does anyone have a guess what the most commonly used drug is in drug facilitated sexual assault?
Weed.
Good guess. Alcohol. I guess it's a kind of a confusing question if you don't consider alcohol a drug, but the most common drug or inhibitor used in a drug facilitated sexual assault is alcohol. And the reason for that is that it's legal, it's cheap, and it's socially acceptable. So it's really easy to get a victim to engage in that, and it can very quickly create an unequal power dynamic. You get someone really drunk, maybe you serve them drinks and you're only serving yourself like virgin, fake drinks or drinks that are made to look like they're alcoholic. It's really easy for a perpetrator to create a really quick unequal power dynamic with alcohol. Now, of course, weed, methamphetamine, things like that are also commonly used, and it's definitely a factor in a lot of drug facilitated sexual assaults. But people don't think about alcohol because it's just part of our social imagination. A lot of people like to think that drugs, like drug facilitated sexual assault, it's a slip of the hand and they're putting a roofie in your drink and you need to cover your drink. And people, that does happen, right? I'm not saying it doesn't, but it ignores the reality that it's much easier to just get someone drunk than to be a magician and sneak something into their drink, right? Okay, power is that through line. Power is the through line through sexual violence and sexual in the community and in confinement, and also human trafficking. The use of power to take from someone else all of their autonomy, all of their control, all of their ability to make their own choices can happen in a short amount of time, because sexual assault is sometimes a long, prolonged experience, or sometimes it's a one-time short experience that leaves a huge impact, right? Sexual violence and confinement kind of ratchets it up because then you have no control over your life and you're in this setting where the people who do have control over your life can abuse you. And then I think trafficking is kind of the ultimate experience of that, where someone systematically strips away your power and makes you complicit in that, in order to control you thoroughly. Power is the ultimate through line through all of this. So when we're thinking about having a trauma-informed approach, when we're thinking about serving survivors, talking to people on the phone, seeing them in our community, it's really, really important that we keep that through line in our heads, because trauma impacts our brain and it impacts the way that we move through the world. So our brains are magical things, and they have this thing called neuroplasticity. And what that means is when something happens to us in our lives, whether it's a trauma or a repeated experience or an education experience or something that we don't even necessarily take on board, like happens to us in our environment, but we don't recognize that that's what's going on. Our brain is constantly learning from all of those experiences, specifically our limbic system. And our brain will change the way that it operates through this because it's neuroplastic. I'm not a brain surgeon or a brain scientist, so I'm sorry, I'm not doing a great job. I would definitely check out this article from the Cleveland Clinic to learn more. But essentially, our brains rewire themselves based on the experiences that we have in life, right? I can attest to that. I was in an emotionally abusive relationship in my early 20s, and I didn't realize that it was emotionally abusive at the time, but it was. And that contributed to a panic attack disorder that I have had basically since then. Because one of the things that my abuser would do is come up behind me, just like sneak up behind me, wait until I was really focused on something, and then scream in my ear to scare me. And he would do that not daily, but very, very often. And so what my brain learned subconsciously is that when I can sense someone standing too close behind me, something bad is about to happen. I didn't know that. I didn't realize that that was happening. I didn't realize that that impact was going to happen to me, or that I was going to deal with this long term, but I do. And it happens a lot of times in the grocery store, actually. If someone comes and stands too close to me or behind me, or they push, people have to push their carts like basically right into the backs of your legs when you're standing in line. For me, if I'm not implementing my coping skills, it will trigger a panic attack, because when I was in that abusive relationship, my brain took in all of the stimuli and learned when someone's too close behind you, something bad is going to happen. That's a very tame example of what can happen to our survivors. I was not able to express why I was having panic attacks at the Walmart every time someone got too close to me. I did not understand what was going on. And it took years of therapy and self work to come to this realization that this happened to me. So it's really important when you're working with someone who has what I would classify as antisocial behaviors, panic attacks, anger issues. They're aggressive. They have mood swings, maybe. It's really important to shift our mindset from what the heck is wrong with them to what happened to them to make them react to stimuli in this way. Why is this person having a panic attack and abandoning their cart in Walmart? It's probably not because that sounds like a fun thing to do or because they think it's a good idea. It's probably because something has happened to them to make them have to do that, to have no other choice but to just escape the situation and go back to their car, right? So it's really important to shift that mindset. One way that you shift your mindset is to really actively listen to what they're saying. People are not going to tell you outright, I'm having a panic attack because I was abused at 20. What they're going to say is, I don't feel safe here. I don't trust you. Why should I trust you? Everyone is a bad person. Nobody's ever been anything but horrible to me. Everything bad happens to me in my life. All of those to me are red flags that we have a history of trauma there that impacts the way that they're going to interact with the world, right? You also need to validate them. People don't really want to hear that what they've experienced is not real, or that it's not important, or that it's not relevant in this moment. Because even though it might not be relevant to you, it's definitely relevant to them. They can feel it in their bodies. You also want to identify and share resources with them, which you guys already do. So I don't need to talk too much about that. And the most important, or one of the most important things, is to set and hold fair boundaries. Something that I talk about with our advocates on the hotline is that we can't let people on the hotline abuse us, because then they're going to turn around and call the next hotline and be horrible to them. There are some people who will call the hotline because they want to have someone to be mad at. They want to have someone to be inappropriate with. They want to have some kind of emotional release so that they can get these feelings out of themselves. If we allow that, if we just say, oh, well, I think, probably they have had some trauma in their life and I should just let them get it out because they'll feel better. What you're then creating is another problem where another person on the line is being mistreated and abused. And I always tell our advocates, you're not the only person on this hotline, and we're not the only hotline in town. I don't want a survivor who has emotional outbursts and mistreats our staff on the line to then turn around and mistreat the staff at 211 because they think that they can just get that quick emotional release there, right? Setting and holding fair boundaries with people so that they're not taking advantage of you is also a part of trauma-informed care. Okay, I moved kind of quickly through that because I am terrible at figuring out how much time I'm going to take for a presentation. Are there questions for me about anything that I've talked about here in this little bit? Okay. When we're putting it all together, we're not going to do this, but essentially when you put it all together, here are our key takeaways. I want you to remember that we serve all victims of sexual violence regardless of their circumstances. I also want you to remember that sexual violence can happen to anyone at any point in time and is life-altering almost every time. Sexual violence in confinement is often more complex than sexual violence in the community because of those conditions of confinement. Sex trafficking is extremely nuanced, and a lot of times survivors don't even realize that they're being trafficked or are unable to access resources, even if they do have that awareness. Sexual violence happens when perpetrators create or exploit an unequal power dynamic, and our brains can change, sometimes permanently, based on the trauma that we experience, sometimes through sexual violence and sometimes through other means. And this change can cause what I would call antisocial behaviors, or cause people to behave erratically and make it more difficult to serve them. And that's where that trauma-informed care comes in. Okay. I will take any final thoughts, questions, comments. This is also all of our contact information, if that would be helpful to you. This is here is our 24/7 hotline. If you ever need to get a hold of Hope Harbor, just call this hotline. Okay, we have some business numbers and things like that. Don't worry about those. Call the hotline. It is staffed 24/7. And if you are trying to speak with a staff advocate during the workday, it is routed to the office. That's why the phone's been ringing in the background here today, because we have the hotline today at the Bowling Green office. So I am going to stop sharing now. I'm sorry, Megan, that I went over. I really did try.
No. You're so good. I appreciate you putting this together for us, Mallory, and for taking the time. Very, very, very informative. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. I am just quickly going to put my ooh, I'm putting my email address in the chat here. If there's ever anything that I can do for you, of course, Megan already has my contact information, but if you have follow-up questions for me, or anything that we need to cover, or that I didn't cover, or that I moved too quickly through, or anything like that, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. I love chatting with our partners, and the work that you guys do is so incredibly valuable to our community. We refer to you all the time. It's a huge relief to us when we can say, I don't know the answer, but I know who does, and let's send you to them. So if there's ever anything that we can do for you, please do not hesitate to ask. Even if we maybe don't have the answer, I will work towards finding that answer for you, because we really, really value our partnership and the work we do together in the community. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you. We
All right,
appreciate
folks.
it.
Thank you so much for your time today. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.